the military is the United States' single largest energy consumer,
Mm,
and it consumes more petroleum than any single institution
right.
in the US. And it is the military that does this in two ways. First of all, through mobility, flying planes, tanks, driving regular cars, and also through having installations and bases, both in the United States and abroad.
Mhm.
So those are the two categories that we like to think about. And the other thing that's important here is that there's military industry. And in general, military industry is more greenhouse gas intensive. That means it has more of the gases that cause global warming
Mhm.
than it uses more energy, more intensive for the cost, for the money spent than other industries.
Welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hammi. Joining us today is Dr. Neta Crawford, the Montague Burton Professor at the University of Oxford and co-director of the Cost of War Project. Dr. Crawford is the author of The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of U.S. Military Emissions, amongst other publications, of course. Dr. Crawford, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thank you. Happy to
And
be here.
of course, Dr. Crawford, today we are here to talk about the relationship between climate change and war. And experts have been sounding the alarm that climate change is an existential threat to organized human life. And on top of that, the threat of nuclear warfare is also an existential threat uh, to organized human life. And for most people, it's easy for us to connect the threat of war, nuclear weapons, to the end of our planet as we know it. But what's not easy for us to do is connect climate change to warfare. And you've done that so effectively. Could you begin by explaining some of the findings in your study about the way in which these two are connected and why we should be alarmed?
Okay, happy to do that. So the most obvious way that climate change and the military are connected is that the military uses a lot of fossil fuel. In the United States, for example, the military is the United States' single largest energy consumer,
Mm,
and it consumes more petroleum than any single institution
right.
in the US. And it is the military that does this in two ways. First of all, through mobility, flying planes, tanks, driving regular cars, and also through having installations and bases, both in the United States and abroad.
Mhm.
So those are the two categories that we like to think about. And the other thing that's important here is that there's military industry. And in general, military industry is more greenhouse gas intensive. That means it has more of the gases that cause global warming
Mhm.
than it uses more energy, more intensive for the cost, for the money spent than other industries. So what we have here is this sort of direct contribution of greenhouse gases which heat the atmosphere of the planet.
Mhm.
And then there's another way that war affects climate, in that war is also often destroying the things that hold on to the carbon that we have. So it's
Mhm.
called sequestration, that is holding the carbon in, for instance, trees or soil. And if, for instance, a war deliberately destroys forests, then
Mhm.
it's not able to provide that sequestration function.
Right.
So that's the war-related
Okay.
emissions. And then, in a couple of instances,
Right.
governments have attacked fossil fuel infrastructure, which
Mhm.
then can release, in the case of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 attacks,
Mhm.
2022, methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas.
Mhm.
And you can set oil wells alight and cause uncontrolled flaring
Mhm.
of methane, and it's a cause for some emissions.
Right. And I wanna help bring this out of the abstract for our audiences who may not know the definition of even some of the words you're talking about. Could you help draw from some real life examples of wars that we've been involved in or things that are happening around the globe right now, i.e., Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, all these different
Sure.
places, right?
Yeah.
To help us understand how we are contributing to the destruction of our planet as we, for whatever reason, as we continue to wage wars around the globe.
Right. Okay. Well, since the 19th century, that is, since the invention of the steam engine, war moved away from locomotion being powered either by arms and legs or horses or cows or wind and waves to being powered by the energy at first of the steam engine and then other kinds of engines later on. So then you get aircraft, and aircraft, in fact, are the very thirsty in terms of fuel consumption. They use many thousands of gallons an hour sometimes. Like I think it's 3,300 gallons or so per hour for flying a B-52, which can take 17 hours to reach its destination. Then it has to be refueled and come back. So every war since the 19th century, which has used industrial equipment like tanks or aircraft or ships that are powered by either coal or then later petroleum, there's been emissions.
Right.
And military industrialization follows the same path as other kinds of industrial productivity. Only in the case of military industrialization, war has helped spur the adoption of new kinds of materials, which in itself has caused an increased interest in having petroleum and protecting access to petroleum. So I'll give you some examples now. In World War I and World War II, this is when aircraft become very important in warfare. And there's increased use of aircraft. And they're also, by the way, using aircraft to target the adversaries' fuel refineries and fuel storage facilities. In the Civil War and also in the Vietnam War and in the war in Ukraine right now, forests have been destroyed. And why destroy forests? Well, in the case of the Civil War, it was to do two things: to make sure that the people who might be sheltering in the forest would have to be flushed out, and it was to punish the South.
Right.
And then in the Vietnam War, mangrove forests were destroyed so that Viet Cong could not hide there. And the Russians have either deliberately or inadvertently destroyed some of the millions of acres of Ukrainian forests. Forests and wetlands were destroyed in the Iraq War through fighting. This is often the case, that the environment is damaged, and what keeps the carbon cycle going is having sequestration, that is the storage of carbon in forests and soil. And if it can't be stored there, then it's released.
Right. And we haven't begun to even talk about, I mean, we have, but like the sort of devastation that is caused by, for example, as we watch Gaza right now, the bombing of every single, of majority, all of the buildings, right? There's sort of energy that is going to take, if they're going to rebuild all of that, the destruction of, the civilian infrastructure, the destruction of the sewage system, of all these things that cost ecological damages for generations to come. And then we also think about, you talked about the cost to operate these machineries, but what kind of carbon is being emitted when like 2,000-pound bombs are dropped from Gaza to Ukraine to all these different places? How is our water, air, land affected as governments continue to wage wars around the globe?
So you have to think about the climate effects of war a little bit separately than the climate effects from just having a military all by itself. So any military has a force that is in being, that's already there. It could be thousands of people or millions of people ready to fight, and they always have bases and installations, and they have equipment that they operate in peacetime just for exercises. So there is, if you have a standing army or a standing armed forces, there's always a greenhouse gas footprint for that. There's also pollution associated with some of those activities. For instance, when aircraft fuel leaks or diesel fuel leaks, and there is in wartime the additional activities of the consumption of that fuel, which goes up And there's also the destruction. The destruction itself, as I've said, destroys the capacity of wetlands and forests and soil to hold carbon, which can then be a problem in terms of increasing global temperatures, global warming.
Mhm.
But the destruction also, if you're destroying infrastructure or people's homes, you want to rebuild. The rebuilding itself is greenhouse gas intensive. It costs a lot of energy to remake, especially if you're going to rebuild with older materials like concrete or steel, and you can't recycle a lot of that. Now, if you can recycle or use different kinds of concrete that is not greenhouse gas intensive, then the effects of rebuilding on the climate are less.
Mhm.
But in general, when you destroy something and then rebuild it, of course, you're going to be needing energy to do that, and
Mhm.
often that is greenhouse gas.
To sort of justify or legitimize some of this ridiculous spending, um, before I even jump into that, your organization, the Cost of War Project, has done a fantastic job documenting the actual real impact and cost of war, whether it is human, on human life, whether it is on the economics of war, or like all these different things, i.e., climate as well. And you've made comparative studies about like the budget of the Pentagon relative to being like the annual budget of many small countries, or being 3 times that of certain departments within the United States. And many would argue, not many, some have argued that this spending, this militarization, is necessary to maintain American hegemony and security. How would you respond to these people? Is it necessary that we keep spending and causing such a huge climate impact at the rate that we are now? Are we safer by doing this, or are we more unsafe?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot in your question, and
Yes.
I can't answer all of it right now.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll just take up the question of the relationship between military spending and our security.
Right.
So what happens every year is Congress authorizes a certain level of military spending.
Mhm.
And you'd think that the level of military spending would be in pretty close relationship to, the real needs of the Pentagon to defend the United States. Then it's a question of, do you want a mission of not just defending the United States from reasonable threats, likely threats, but being able to control outcomes throughout the world? The way the United States military is structured, with its 750 to 800 bases all over the world and its ability to project power from aircraft carriers, it can control a lot of outcomes, at least in the short term,
Mm.
or it can try to.
Right.
And that's how American hegemony is maintained in a physical way. There's also the ideas that the United States has, the economic institutions that it has that project American power or are part of American power.
Mhm.
Now, you can believe that it's good to have the United States on top or not, but that's the reality. That's what's happening. Is the administration, whether Democrat or Republican, after administration, has said that the United States should remain preeminent.
Mhm.
And that's what those military forces are meant to demonstrate and to do, is maintain US military power. Now, is it that the budget is in line with those aspirations? It's over-insuring. We are over-insured for both our defense. The United States is, in fact, surrounded on two sides, at least, by moats, rather large moats. And we don't expect invasion of a military sort from Canada or Mexico or the Caribbean islands. We're pretty safe in terms of defending most of the homeland. Hawaii is pretty far away, but we're pretty safe. So the rest of that budget is really about projecting power. And we should have a debate in the United States about the costs and consequences of this capacity to project power, because maybe we're spending resources on this capacity. It is more than 50% of the discretionary budget in any one year. Maybe we're spending resources on that when we could be making ourselves more secure in terms of turning to renewable energy, or bolstering the healthcare system and increasing access to people who have to wait a very long time to just see their doctor, or making sure that the infrastructure is functional, that bridges and roads work, and transitioning to renewable energy so that we can slow the pace of climate change. We really need to turn on a dime with climate change. And if we're spending resources that could be spent in a way that would make us secure in that respect, I think we should be. We should be doing that.
Thank you so much for that. And lastly, your book talks about potential solutions to address this impending catastrophe. And you talk about things like maybe we don't need all the bases that we have around the world. Could you talk about a way forward, a path forward, on how we ensure a collective future where like we're not just pushing away our ultimate demise?
Right. So everybody has to do something about climate change, right? It's something that demands every sector change its energy use if it's fossil fuel. That we think about the things that we do, which are greenhouse gas intensive, that like, for instance, meat consumption, which is very greenhouse gas intensive because cows actually emit methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than actually carbon is. The military isn't in other words, what I'm saying is the military isn't the only sector that needs to be rethought fundamentally. But if we're just focused on the military for a moment, then, as I've said, it is the United States' single largest energy user, and we've got bases all over the world. We have many bases and tens of thousands of people constantly, day in, day out, in the Persian Gulf. And part of their job, when it's not just to defend allies, is to protect the flow of oil that we in fact increasingly don't need. We have decreasing consumption of Persian Gulf oil, and we also shouldn't burn. We need to make that transition. So we're spending money and lives and emitting greenhouse gases to protect a resource that we need to be moving away from. So part of the argument in the book is that given this decreased dependence, we should radically reduce the size of the forces in the Persian Gulf and Middle East. They have other roles. If there is a big threat to Persian Gulf oil, the United States can get there quickly. But this, to me, is low-hanging fruit. Another kind of low-hanging fruit, we can immediately do it if Congress has the capacity to do it, and they do. We could reduce the number of bases in the United States and abroad. And this has been done in the 1990s and early 2000s. It was called base realignment and closure. The Pentagon says that they have about 20% excess capacity at their bases and installations. They have 20% more than they need. So they could identify for Congress some of that excess. So we could immediately see reductions there in a couple of years if there's the political courage to do base realignment and closure. But more than that, we could rethink the entire structure because a lot of it is legacy. In other words, it's left from what was done before, right? It's there. We haven't necessarily rethought whether we need it. We just keep doing it because we've done it. And there is an opportunity to go beyond 20% reductions thoughtfully, carefully, with an eye toward converting these installations and bases towards civilian uses. And some of those civilian uses could in fact be for solar farms or wind farms or for geothermal. They could be, in other words, contributing renewable energy to the grid for all of us, and then decreasing the need, again, for any imports or fossil fuel consumption that comes from domestic oil. There are efficiencies to be gained by the military changing light bulbs and things like that, but what we can do all that, and we have to do these other things.
Right.
Rethink the structure, close some of those bases, convert those bases to alternative energy sources. Of course, many of those bases are filled with toxins because that's a lot of what happens in the military is you have fuels and other chemicals that are toxic. They have to be cleaned up. They will be Superfund sites among them, toxic messes. That has to happen, but they can be restored. And some of them, like in Massachusetts, where my house is, have been turned into parks and shopping malls. And this can happen all over the country.
Dr. Crawford, thank you so much for all your work, and thank you for being on Let's Just Talk. We look forward to continuing these important conversations with you.
Thank you for having me. Take care.